Let's pray. Lord, thank you for that brother yesterday that sent me that prayer. And I just pray it over me right now, that you would protect me. You would keep me from being unbalanced, unbiblical, and unloving. And I pray, Lord, that you would change me and you would change those who will hear today. Lord, I pray that we would see you and be led to greater and greater devotion and loyalty to you. In Jesus' name, amen. If you would, turn to Isaiah chapter 6, the book of Isaiah. One of the major prophets. The first one that we see right after the wisdom literature, after Psalms, Proverbs, Songs, Solomon, Ecclesiastes, we have Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 6. Today we're going to talk about that there is no one like the Lord. And we're going to talk about the holiness of God. And what I know, because I myself, when I thought about what is the holiness of God, the first and primary thing I thought about was sinlessness. And that's true and that's right. But that is not the primary definition of holiness when it's used in the Bible in regards to God. That's not the primary one. It's one of them, but it's not the primary and the main one and the main thrust and the main emphasis of the Bible when it talks about the holiness of God. I'm going to read you a couple scriptures, and you don't turn to them. I'll just read you them just as a means of defining them, helping us define this holiness of God. The first one is in Exodus 3:14, when Moses is at the burning bush, and he said, "Okay, I'm going to go, but who do I tell them sent me?" And the only way that God could tell him how to describe himself to the children of Israel was to say this. God said to Moses, "I am who I am." He said this he said, "Say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you." God can only compare himself to himself. Okay? If you go to my boss's barn today, you're going to see two tractors. They're like each other. They're tractors. Okay? They do similar things. Okay, both of them actually can do the same thing, one just on a lesser scale because it's a little bit smaller, and one on a bigger scale, but there is some differences to it. Okay, but they're both similar. They're tractors. So I could look at the green tractor and say, well, what's your other tractor look like if it wasn't there? I'd say, well, it's similar to this. It's kind of like this. But God can't do that. God can't say, I am like this, or I am like that. Because when He has done that, He has compared Himself to a lesser thing or lesser being, and what He's doing is He's removing from Himself, He's making Himself more like them, and He would bring the separation between creature and God closer. And He can't do that. So He says, you want to know who I am? I am who I am. That's who I am. But then several thousands of years later, He was able to say this, I am like Him. And He pointed to His Son Jesus. Next is Exodus 15:11. Exodus 15:11. Who is like you, O Lord, among the gods? It's a rhetorical question. Moses asks a rhetorical question. If you read the Bible, the way that we are taught in so much of the Bible is through rhetorical questions. I love it. Paul's like, he asks a question, then he answers the question. Or today, Moses is singing a song. He says, Who is like you, O Lord, among the gods? The answer, no one. The answer is no one. Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glorious deeds, doing wonders? So in there, he's not referring just to God's sinlessness. Okay? He's referring to something else, and I'll get to that when I get done reading these verses. 1 Samuel 2:2. We see the prayer of Hannah, and we see her say something very similar. There is none holy like the Lord. There is none besides you. There is no rock like our God. And then lastly, in the same book, in Isaiah 40:25. 40:25. To whom then will you compare me, that I should be like him, says the Holy One? And the answer is, no one. There's no one that you can compare me to. Great is thy faithfulness. There's no faithfulness like the Lord's. How deep the Father's love. There's no love like the Lord. There's no well like Jesus' well. There's no water like the living water of Jesus Christ. He can't be compared. There's no one to compare him to. So those are just a few verses. The primary focus when we're talking about that God is holy is that God is above and beyond anyone and anything. Or a big word is he's transcendent. He's above and beyond everything and everyone. It can be said like this: God is apart. God is sacred. God is set apart. God is cut out. God is completely separate from all of his beings. God is not like you and me, just bigger and better. No, he's nothing like us. He is absolutely, completely, radically different than you and I. That's why that's why it's so difficult even to come and talk about something like this, because you're afraid you might say something that's like, well, God's kind of like this. No, he's not like anything. If you ever hear anybody say, God's like this, you know automatically that it may work, it may help you with an illustration, but it's faulty and it's weak. Because you can't compare God to anything that we can see with our own eyes. You can't compare him to that. God is not bigger and better than us. God alone is God and cannot be compared or likened to anything. He's distinct. He is unique. Some of the old theologians would say, when you talk about God's holiness, you're talking about God's otherness. How he's just other than, completely different. He's altogether, in all of his ways, in all of his being, different. Completely different than you and I. He is not like you and I. And hopefully we'll see how often we think he is. I'm not trying to define God, but I want to define the word holiness. And it means to cut out. Okay? To be cut out and set apart. So, if you take a vegetable and you set it on the counter, a carrot or something, and you cut a piece of that carrot off, you've just made that piece and you've set it apart from the rest of the carrot. Okay? It's distinct. It's set out. So when you hear of holy days in the Bible and holy utensils and holy this and holy this and holy, it's something that has been cut out and separated and set unto God's purpose. It's made sacred. Okay? Kind of like this. Holidays. Aren't holidays still in America special days, aren't they? They're distinct. They're different. Tomorrow, most people they're not really going to celebrate or remember the military, although we should probably do that. But they just think it's another day off, right? But it is. It's a special day. We've set this day apart, all right? And it's turned into something special, all right? It's distinct from the next day, Tuesday, isn't it? It's cut out from the rest of the month to be something different and distinct. Okay? So, when we come back to God and we put that God is cut out, we're talking about that God is so completely separate from us that we can't get to Him. We can't understand Him. We can't fathom Him with our mind. We can't say enough things about Him with our words to clearly portray Him. Okay? He's altogether different. So let's look at the encounter that Isaiah has with this holy God. In the year that King Uzziah died, Isaiah 6, verse 1. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of His robe filled the temple. Above Him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 He covered His face, with 2 He covered His feet, with 2 He flew. And He called, it's so funny, I already know, like, so many people are like, I hope He talks about these angels. I hope He tells me about these wings and these seraphim. Okay, we're not going to deal with the angels today, so just make sure your mind's not even there right now. Because I know I'm thinking the same thing. I read it today and I'm like, what is going on with these angels and their 6 wings and this stuff? We're not going to deal with that today. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of His glory. And the foundations of the thresholds shook at the voice of Him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. And Isaiah said, Woe is me! I'm lost. I'm a man of unclean lips. I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a burning coal that he had taken with the tongs from the altar. And he touched my mouth and said, Behold, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away. Your sin is atoned for. And I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? Then I said, Here I am, send me. And He said, Go say to the people, keep on hearing, but go say to this people, keep on hearing, but do not understand. Keep on seeing, but do not perceive. Okay. I'm going to take you back kind of just in, not like in, you don't have to turn back and forth there, but you can see a similar thing happen to Peter in Luke 5, 1 through 11, when he encounters Jesus Christ. And I'm going to share some of those things with you. But just so that you guys, in case in the going through this sermon, you forget what we're talking about. 4 things we're going to look at. We're going to look at the uniqueness of God. We're going to look at the undoing of sinners who encounter this unique God. And we're going to look at how this unique God takes this undone sinner and He unites them together. So we're going to look at the uniqueness of God, the undoing of the sinner, the uniting of God and sinner, and the undeniable obedience that comes from a person who's been reconciled to that God. So we're going to look at those things this morning. First, the uniqueness of God. Notice this. He puts in here, and I've read this so many times, and I was listening to some guys and reading some things, and everybody would make a point about the fact that King Uzziah died. And I'm like, what does it matter that King Uzziah... Well, it's a big thing, because King Uzziah was one of the greatest kings, next to David, okay, that the children of Israel had, and he died. And what Isaiah does here is he says, In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord. He's saying, listen, your king may have died. The king is not dead. I saw him. He's eternal. He's alive. He is apart from that king that ruled over you in Israel. He's not like that king in Israel. That king died. God is eternal. So what makes God apart? Well, think about it. Is there any other being that's eternal? Like God? Were we created? So we had a time of being born, and we'll live forever, but God was before everything? Is there any being that's a spirit and can be anywhere at all times, completely, perfectly, all of his being in the same place, everywhere at one time? No, there's no one. Is there one that has all power? to do whatever He pleases and no one can stop Him? No, there's not. Is there one who's perfect? Anybody else like God who's perfectly complete and doesn't lack anything? There isn't. So all these attributes of God that we've been looking at, God being eternal, all those omnis, omnipresent, omniscient, omnipotent, His eternal, His Spirit, the fact He's perfect, all of those things, the fact there's only one of Him, there's no one like Him, all of those things set Him apart from everyone else. So we look at the kings of Israel, and God saying over and over again, He says, they died. That king died and he was buried. That king died and he was buried. That king died and he was buried. And then they look at their priest. That priest died and he was buried. He said, that's because there is no priest. And even this, think about this. Jesus Christ is our prophet, priest, and king. And every prophet that we read in the Bible died. Every king that we read about in the Bible died. Every priest that we read about in the Bible died, except the one. That's because He's apart from, and He's set apart from that. He is greater than. Look at this part. He says, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne. He sits upon the throne. He rules this entire universe sitting down. Without effort. It doesn't take any effort. He gets to sit down and rule the entire universe. It's not thinking that God's like us and He sits and there's a big throne and He sits down, okay? What He's doing is this. He's saying God rules the whole entire universe effortlessly. God's not straining to hold everything together. God's not going like this with His hands because of ISIS. He's not sitting there going, I don't know what to do with these guys. They're a bunch of nutcases. It's not what He's doing. I don't know what to do with these crazy people in the Middle East and all these other people and the people in America. I just don't know what to do with them. I'll go a step further. What's going on is what He's doing with them. Because He does what He pleases. And He's sovereign over every heart that beats on this planet. Because He's God. There's no one that could sit on a throne. He's high. He's lifted. He's above everything. He sees everything. He knows everything. And Isaiah sees this God. And then he says, His train filled the temple. He fills the whole earth. The whole earth is full of His glory. There's things that you and I can never even see, and God sees it, and it glorifies Him. And what we have is these angels, and they're flying, and they're covering their face because they can't even see the glory of God. Remember Moses? He had to hide Moses because he couldn't see. He said, if you see all of my glory, you'll die. Even these sinless angels in heaven, they're covering their face. They can't see, they can't look upon it. And they're covering their feet. Some say it's a picture of modesty. They're covering up themselves. They're hiding themselves from this glory. And they're sitting there. If you read Revelation, and some of you guys get tired of the hymns. You're like, man, could we just sing some different hymns? Could we do this? Could we sing? I want to sing some more hymns too. You know what the hymn song is in the Bible? Or in heaven right now? Just over and over again. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. And they just sit there. They've been doing it forever, and it's never getting old to them. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, the Lord of hosts. And then this angel, when they said that, everything shook. And so what we see is God is eternal. Kings die, God doesn't die. The King of the universe is always living. That He's high and lifted up. He's above and beyond all of us. That He rules with sovereignty, effortlessly. That He's the one King, the one true prophet, and the one true priest. That the whole earth is full of a reflection of who God is, of His power, of His might. How many of you see like tornadoes and say, I mean, it's a tragedy, and we should be sympathetic and merciful, but I mean, you just stop and say, that thing has no power compared to God. We're talking about a God, when He speaks, the mountains will melt. That makes a tornado look like a sissy. I mean, He just has to speak, and they melt. We see the power of God. Think about an angel, okay, who's not a chubby little baby. Just, when I heard that this week as I was listening to things, like, that is right, amen, brother. Because I'm like, who wants to, these angels are doing crazy stuff in the Bible. We weren't going to talk about angels, but I'm just going to say this real quick. They did crazy stuff in the Bible, and we think of them as these chubby little babies. This baby spoke. If he's a chubby little baby and he made the whole threshold shake, okay? He's probably got some power to him. But we know that there is that same angel who spoke, hid himself from that one who's all powerful. And because He's high and lifted up, and above all, He can see all, and He's present in all. It all fills the temple. It all fills the earth. The one and only true God that no one can come close to. And Isaiah sees Him, and then look what it does to Isaiah. Look what it does. This God that's holy, that's unique, that's set apart. Okay, think about this. I want you to remember this when you think of holiness. All of God's attributes are holy. So there's none faithful like Him. There's none loving like Him. There's none forgiving like Him. There's none gracious like Him. There's none merciful like Him. There's none patient like Him. There's none gentle like Him. There's none like Him. So when you start thinking about all those attributes of God, there's none. You can't compare anybody to those things. There's none like Him. He is so much greater. Do you know how awesome that is? Because so many people are not merciful. And so many people are not gracious. And it's okay. Because I can go to God and know that there's greater mercy there. When people are like, you are a messed up sinner. You're right. You don't have any idea. And God is graciously greater. Or God is greater in grace, and greater in mercy, and greater in love. You know why you and I have a hard time with understanding God's love for us? Because it's greater than our mind can comprehend. So if you're at the point where you're like, I don't understand His love, good. You'll never understand it. It'll never completely get to the point where you're like, that whole God loving me thing, I got to figure it out. Never. Because all the days of your life, you're going to learn more and more about His love. And then for eternity, you're going to know more about His love. And 10 trillion years from now, you won't know everything about His love, or His grace, or His mercy, or His forgiveness. This is incredible. Why in the world do angels who don't need forgiveness of sin because they're sinless say, holy, holy, holy? It's because they know God is unique and God is set apart from every other being. That's why it's the primary thing. So I want to deal with this first rather than next week when we deal with the holiness of God's purity and how He is sinless and apart from man's corruption. Now, look what the holiness of God does. The response in verse 5, the undoing of a sinner. Woe is me, for I am lost. Isaiah pronounces a curse on himself when he sees the holiness of God. When he sees this great God, when he sees this God set apart and different and unique above all things, he sees himself as a wretched and a vile and a pathetic person. I'm sorry. You and I have to understand something. Our whole life, of most of us in America, it's been about pepping us up and making us feel good about ourselves. Let me tell you something. There is nothing in you and I that we need to be happy with. apart from Christ. There's nothing in you and I that we need to be. We need our egos lifted up. We have a low self-esteem, so we need to be lifted up. I'm telling you guys, when we see God, we see how pathetic we are, how undone we are, how wretched we are, how much we realize, how much we see that we are not like Him, and how much we have acted as if He is just like us. Think about it. How many of you, think about this, the pastor shows up, or just listen. So I'm talking to people, and then they're just cussing up a storm. I don't really ever say anything, and then they ask me something, and I say, well, I always start with the ranch part, because I'm not gonna dive right in there, because I want to talk with me, because when they hear pastor, they just shut off. I'm done with you. Go about your business. Move on. Over with. Okay. So just talking. We're gonna rant. What else do I? This, that, and that. A pastor of church. Oh, here. Sorry about that. And then if someone shows up, and they come, dude, stop. It's the pastor, man. You can't be talking like that. Pardon my language. I'm sorry. That's weird. You come over, or they don't want you to come to their house because they're like, there's stuff going on in my house I really don't want you to see. I mean, they don't say that, but then you figure out later that's kind of what's going on. And that's it's everybody. I'm just telling you. Or they hide stuff because the Christian's around. They don't talk a certain way because they find out you're a Christian. Do you see how we've made God just like us? Because we don't think He sees and hears all of it. We don't think He sees it all. We don't think He hears it all. And the only time we get uncomfortable is when someone else is around. Well, know this, He's always around. And He sees and He hears everything. He is not like me. I can think every single one of you guys are the most holy people in the world. You got the most holy church on the planet. Okay? Because I see this right here. I can just see how you come in, and I can see that, and all of us are really kind of dressed pretty, and it's some pretty people. Okay? But I don't know what goes on outside of you most of the time, for most of you guys. Now, some of you I do. It's because I tricked you. I thought it made you my friends, and I'm going to get in there a little bit, and I'm just kidding. So, I don't see all of that beyond. But God does. I don't hear it all, but God does. I don't know your heart, but God does. And don't use that as an excuse when someone tells you something. Well, you don't know my heart. God does. That should scare you to death. That should not bring a bunch of encouragement in your life. Well, God knows my heart. Trust me, I know a little bit about my heart, and I know that He knows more about my heart, so I'm not encouraged by that. It doesn't uplift me. But when my heart condemns me, I know God's greater than my heart. So we see this. When we see this God lifted up, it wrecks us. It humbles us. It exposes us. We realize that we're nothing like God, that God's above us, and we say, woe is me, I'm undone. I'm a man and a woman of unclean lips with an unclean heart. I'm undone. It exposes the greatest sin in our life, unbelief. That's what it does. It exposes the greatest sin about us, and that's unbelief. You know why unbelief's the greatest sin? Because it's slander against God's character. And we can't get any worse than that. You can slander me. Slander God, that's a whole other story. Because we're not believing God. You say, well, what about the sin in my life? I do this sin. I don't really think it's unbelief. Really? Is God all-powerful? Can He deliver you from that sin? Yes. Why hasn't He yet? Or this. Was it Adam and Eve? Was it the sin of eating the apple that was so bad? No, it was their heart. They said, God, you don't know what's best for me. I know what's best for me, and I'm going to eat this fruit. the heart issue is when we say yes to sin, yes to do the things that God doesn't want us to do, and yes to the things that or no to the things He tells us to do, and we're sinning against Him. We're saying, God, you don't have wisdom. You don't know what's best. I do. You don't. And I'm going to go this way. Our pride's exposed. That we think more highly about ourselves, okay? Our pride gets revealed by God. When we see God lifted up, when we see and look at Him and we see that we're much worse and much lesser and below Him, our pride's exposed because we've been trying to exalt ourselves to be just like Him. We see our lack of love for the great and infinite and worthy One. When we see God high and lifted up and we see how we've settled for everything less, it's humbling. It's a humbling thing. When we look and say, my life has been filled with chasing down all sorts of ridiculous idols, like in our country, wealth and education. We will educate. Now listen, I'm about education. I wish I was more educated. I wish I knew English better and I could tell you everything about commas and where they need to go and everything, okay? I'm not against education. But I am against education when it comes to the sacrifice of our children's souls and purity. We've elevated so much all these things and say, this is what we need to go for. This is the American dream. And God says, no, I am it. Those things are all, some of them are good and right and okay. Go after them for God. But don't let those be the primary, the thing that your whole focus is upon. Can you play sports? Absolutely. But what's the whole purpose? Why are you doing it? What's the whole motivation? Can you watch movies? Sure. Some you can't. But all I'm saying is, think about this. Are you finding your satisfaction and your enjoyment in anything other than God? Because if we are worshiping an idol, and it does need to be destroyed. Now, the great thing is we may see things in our life, we may be